The townspeople of Redemption Creek had mocked Magnolia Beaumont for her weight and given her away to a Comanche warrior, expecting her humiliation to be complete. Instead, she stood in the dusty main street watching something she had never seen before: respect in a stranger's eyes. Mayor Cornelius Whitmore wiped sweat from his brow. His voice carried across the silent crowd like gravel thrown against glass. The trade was done. The unwanted woman for safe passage through Comanche territory. Everyone knew it was theater. Everyone knew she was disposable. Magnolia felt the heat rise from the packed earth beneath her worn boots. 6 months of widowhood had taught her to read faces. The mayors held satisfaction. The crowds held cruel amusement. But the Comanche warrior's face told a different story. He sat his painted horse with the stillness of deep water. His dark eyes moved from the mayor to her without hurry. When he spoke, his voice cut through the morning air clean as a blade. "You come, no harm." The words were meant for her. Alone, not the crowd. Not the mayor. Her. Whitmore stepped closer to the warrior's horse. His boots kicked up small clouds that settled on his black coat. The satisfaction in his face had grown into something hungrier. "At least we won't have to worry about her stirring up trouble about those papers anymore," he whispered. The words hit Magnolia's chest like cold water. Solomon's papers. The ones hidden in her cabin. The ones she had been too afraid to examine since his death. The warrior's eyes shifted to Whitmore. Something passed between them that made the mayor step back. Then those same eyes returned to Magnolia with the patience of someone who understood waiting. She touched the leather satchel hanging at her side. Solomon's final gift. The last thing he had pressed into her hands before the fever took him. Inside were documents she had never found the courage to read. Numbers and names and signatures that had made her late husband pace their small cabin floor deep into winter nights. The crowd began to murmur. Women pulled their children closer. Men fingered the handles of tools that could become weapons. But the warrior made no move toward violence. He simply extended his hand toward her. Magnolia looked back at the faces surrounding her. Mrs. Henderson from the general store. Tom Miller who fixed wagon wheels. The Pattersons who attended the same church. People who had smiled at her when Solomon was alive. People who had turned their backs when he died. Their expressions held no warmth now. Only the satisfaction of watching someone else's misfortune unfold. She realized with sharp clarity that staying meant slow death. Going meant unknown possibility. She stepped toward the warrior's horse. The animal was smaller than she expected. Painted with symbols that meant nothing to her, but everything to him. The warrior's hand remained extended, steady as stone. When she took it, his grip was firm without being harsh. He pulled her up behind him with the easy strength of someone accustomed to such things. The horse shifted beneath their combined weight, but did not protest. From this height, she could see the entire crowd. Their upturned faces held disappointment that the spectacle was ending so quietly. They had wanted fear, screaming, some dramatic finale to justify their cruelty. Instead, they got silence. The warrior spoke a single word in his own language. The horse began to move, not quickly, not with urgency, with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. As they rode past the last buildings of Redemption Creek, Magnolia felt the weight of watching eyes fade behind them. The satchel pressed against her hip with each step of the horse. Solomon's secrets rode with her into unknown country. The warrior had not asked her name, had not demanded anything beyond her presence. His back was straight against the morning sun, his breathing steady and unhurried. Miles passed before he spoke again. "Ketna," he said without turning, his own name offered freely. "Magnolia," she replied, "but most call me Maggie." He nodded. Once, the gesture held more acknowledgement than she had received from the people of Redemption Creek since Solomon's burial. The horse carried them deeper into territory she had never seen. Country that belonged to neither railroad nor settler, but to wind and grass and the patient turning of seasons. Behind them, smoke from the town's chimneys made thin lines against the sky. Ahead lay only horizon and possibility. The satchel containing Solomon's papers seemed lighter somehow, as if distance from Redemption Creek had lessened its burden. Katana's presence was unlike anything she had expected. The townspeople had spoken of Comanche warriors with the same tone they used for wolves or winter storms. Natural disasters, to be feared and avoided. But the man riding before her moved with quiet purpose. His hands on the reins were gentle. When the horse stumbled on loose stones, he steadied the animal with patient words in his own language. The sun climbed higher. The horse's hooves found their rhythm on ground that had known countless such journeys. Magnolia felt something inside her chest begin to unknot. The tight band of fear and shame that had lived there since Solomon's death. For the first time in months, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The horse's hooves marked time against earth that had never known plow or fence. 3 days into country that stretched beyond the edges of any map Magnolia had ever seen. Ketna rode with the stillness of someone who carried the landscape inside him. They stopped at midday beside a creek that ran clear over smooth stones. Ketna dismounted first. His movements held the economy of someone who wasted nothing, not motion, not words, not the precious water he cupped in his hands to drink. Magnolia slid down from the horse with less grace. Her legs trembled from the unfamiliar riding. Her back ached from holding herself upright for hours, but she made no complaint. Complaint was a luxury she had learned to live without. Ketna produced dried meat from a leather pouch. He handed her half without ceremony. The gesture held more kindness than the elaborate Sunday dinners the church ladies had brought after Solomon's funeral. Those had come with expectations. This came with nothing but sustenance. The meat was tough and salty. It tasted of smoke and patience. She chewed slowly and watched Ketna tend to his horse. His hands moved over the animal's flanks with careful attention, checking for soreness, stones in the hooves, small injuries that could become large problems. "You know horses," she said. He glanced at her. Something that might have been surprise flickered in his dark eyes. "You know many things." The words carried weight she could not yet measure. He knew about her bookkeeping. Her reputation for keeping careful numbers had somehow traveled beyond Redemption Creek into territory she had never imagined. They rested in the shade of cottonwoods that whispered secrets to the wind. Ketna taught her the Comanche word for water, for horse, for the hawk that circled overhead with wings spread wide against the endless sky. "Pia," he said, touching the leather satchel at her side. "Marks that speak," she nodded. The papers inside Solomon's satchel were indeed marks that spoke, though what they said remained a mystery locked behind her own fear of knowing. On the second day, fever found her. It started as heaviness behind her eyes. By evening, she shivered despite the warmth radiating from their small fire. Her body betrayed her when she needed strength most. The contaminated water from a stagnant pool had done what fear and exhaustion could not. Ketna watched her with the intensity of someone reading weather signs. When she could no longer sit upright, he moved without hesitation. His hands were gentle as he helped her lie down on his own blanket. His voice was soft as he spoke words in Comanche that needed no translation. He brewed tea from plants she could not name, bitter herbs that cut through the fever's fog. When she was too weak to hold the cup, he supported her head with one hand and tipped the liquid to her lips with patience that seemed limitless. Through the long night, he tended the fire, applied cool water to her burning forehead. Never once did his attention waver. Never once did she sense anything but careful concern for her well-being. In her delirium, she spoke Solomon's name. Ketna listened without judgment to words that tumbled out in fever dreams. Stories of her late husband's kindness, his sudden death, the mysterious papers he had pressed into her hands with urgent whispers about truth and danger. When morning came, the fever had broken. Magnolia woke to find herself covered with Katana's second blanket. He sat nearby, feeding small sticks to the fire with methodical attention. His eyes held exhaustion that spoke of a sleepless night spent in vigil. "Better," he said when he saw her watching. She tried to sit up. Her body protested but obeyed. The world no longer spun with sickness. Her thoughts moved in straight lines, instead of fever circles. "Thank you." The words seemed insufficient for what he had done. In Redemption Creek, illness meant isolation. People feared contagion more than they valued compassion. But this man had risked his own health to care for someone the world had thrown away. Ketna reached into another pouch and produced a handful of berries, purple and sweet and perfect. He placed them in her palm with the same careful attention he gave everything else. "Pia Tekwapu," he said. "Woman who sees truth." The name settled around her shoulders more comfortably than any dress she had ever worn. In his language, she was not the unwanted widow, not the woman too heavy for marriage or too poor for respect. She was someone who could see what others missed. On the third day, they reached the edge of hill country that rolled away toward distant mountains. The horse picked its way down slopes covered with grass that moved in waves beneath the constant wind. Everything here was larger than life in Redemption Creek. The sky stretched wider. The silence ran deeper. Even her own breath seemed to carry further in the thin air. Ketna pointed toward a line of trees that marked another creek. Smoke rose from beyond the tree line in thin ribbons that spoke of careful fires and waiting people. "Home," he said. But before they reached the trees, a figure emerged from tall grass beside the trail. A woman with dark skin and knowing eyes. She wore a mixture of clothing that belonged to no single world. Calico skirt and beaded vest, leather boots and silver bracelets that caught the afternoon light. Ketna raised his hand in greeting. The woman approached with the confidence of someone who feared nothing on this earth. "Birdie Crow Feather," she said to Magnolia. Her voice carried education and authority in equal measure. "We need to talk." She looked back toward Redemption Creek, with eyes that held dangerous knowledge. Her next words fell into the silence between them, heavy as stones dropped into still water. "The blue coats are asking questions about a dead man's papers." Magnolia's hand moved instinctively to the satchel at her side. Solomon's secrets pressed against her hip with new urgency. The peaceful journey was ending. The reckoning had found them even here in country that belonged to wind and grass and the patient turning of seasons. Katana's eyes moved between the two women. Understanding passed between them that needed no translation. The woman Redemption Creek had discarded carried something worth killing for. Something that made her more valuable than the people who had thrown her away could ever imagine. The horse stood motionless beneath them, waiting for direction that would change everything. Katana's winter camp nestled in the protected valley like seeds in cupped hands. Lodges made of hide and bent wood stood in careful arrangement beside the creek. Smoke rose from cooking fires that spoke of families and evening meals and the simple continuance of life. Chief Nadua emerged from the largest lodge with the bearing of someone who had earned authority through wisdom rather than birth. Her hair was silver-streaked with black. Her eyes held depths that spoke of choices made and prices paid. When she looked at Magnolia, she saw not a burden but a possibility. "Welcome, Pia Tekwapu," she said. "We have been waiting." The greeting settled around Magnolia's shoulders with unexpected warmth. No one in Redemption Creek had ever waited for her. She had been tolerated, endured, dismissed, but never anticipated. Ketna helped her down from the horse with hands that lingered a moment longer than necessary. The touch was becoming familiar, a steady presence in a world that had offered little steadiness. Children peered at her from behind their mothers' skirts. Their eyes held curiosity without judgment. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as simply herself rather than a collection of failures and disappointments. The lodge Nadua showed her was small but complete. Sleeping robes arranged with care, a fire pit ready for kindling, tools hung from wooden pegs with the precision of someone who understood that survival depended on knowing where everything belonged. "This was my daughter's," Nadua said, "before the spotted sickness took her." The words carried grief worn smooth. By time, Magnolia understood. She had learned to live with loss that never quite healed but eventually stopped bleeding. That evening, she sat beside the communal fire with the sewing basket Chief Nadua had given her. Winter was coming early this year. The children needed warm clothes. Her needle moved through tough hide with the rhythm of someone who had spent years mending and making and keeping things whole. Ketna watched her work with quiet attention. His presence had become a constant, not overwhelming, not demanding. Simply there when she needed it and respectfully distant when she needed space. "You make strong stitches," he said. "Solomon taught me. He said everything worth having was worth keeping in good repair." The mention of her late husband no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Ketna listened to her stories about Solomon with the same respect he showed everything else. He never tried to replace the memory or diminish its importance. A week passed before Birdie Crowfeather appeared at the lodge entrance. She carried herself with the authority of someone who moved easily between worlds. Her mixed heritage had given her access to conversations that stayed hidden from others. "The trade wasn't an accident," she said without preamble. "I arranged it." Magnolia's needle stopped moving. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Whitmore was Domdo, planning to kill you, make it look like an accident, or illness, or just another woman who couldn't survive on her own." The leather in Magnolia's hand suddenly felt cold. She had known Whitmore disliked her questions about Solomon's death, but murder had seemed beyond even his cruelty. "Your husband found something before he died. Something that scared powerful people. They thought burying him would bury the truth, but you kept asking questions." Birdie sat down beside the fire. Her face was illuminated by flames that cast dancing shadows on the lodge walls. "I knew Solomon. He came to me sometimes, asked about Comanche land agreements, treaty boundaries. He was mapping something that wasn't supposed to be mapped." Magnolia's hand moved to the satchel she carried everywhere. Solomon's papers pressed against her palm through the leather. Documents she had been too afraid to examine. What did he find? Truth, the kind that gets people killed. Birdie's words settled into the silence like stones dropped into deep water. Magnolia thought of Solomon's restless nights in the months before his death. His careful questions about railroad surveys. His sudden interest in legal documents and land ownership records. "The railroads coming through," Birdie continued. "But not where they told Congress, not where they told the treaties. They're taking Comanche winter grounds and New Hope settlement. Every acre of good land between here and the Rio Grande. New Hope was where the freed families had built their dreams. Small farms carved from government land that had been promised to them after the war. Magnolia had friends there. People who had worked themselves to bone building something that belonged to them. How long do we have? 2 weeks. Maybe less. Survey teams are already marking boundaries." Ketna had been listening from the lodge entrance. Now he stepped into the firelight with the careful movements of someone who had just learned his world was ending. "The young men want to fight," he said. "Tokala speaks of raids, of taking horses and guns, of showing the white men that Comanche land is not free for the taking." Magnolia saw the weight in his shoulders, the impossible choice between violence. That would bring destruction and peace, that would bring dispossession. "There might be another way," she said. Both Bertie and Ketna looked at her with sudden attention. She touched the satchel again, Solomon's final gift. The papers she had carried without understanding their power. Solomon wasn't just mapping land, he was mapping corruption. If the railroad is taking land illegally, there are people in Washington who would want to know. You think white men's courts will care about Comanche rights? Bertie's voice held skepticism earned through bitter experience. I think they care about money. And votes. And keeping their own hands clean when newspapers start asking questions. Ketna sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his body. Close enough that when he spoke, his words were meant for her alone. This is dangerous, for you, for all of us. She looked at him in the firelight, saw the concern in his dark eyes, the growing affection he tried to hide, the fear of losing someone else to the violence that seemed to follow everywhere. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. That night, she finally opened Solomon's satchel, spread his papers across the lodge floor in careful arrangement. Maps and surveys and legal documents that painted a picture of systematic theft. Names and dates and signatures that connected railroad executives to federal officials, to local politicians, in a web of corruption that stretched from Redemption Creek to Washington. Ketna sat beside her as she worked. He asked careful questions about the marks on paper, the numbers that showed land values, the signatures that meant legal ownership. His intelligence surprised her. His understanding of complex concepts that had nothing to do with traditional Comanche life. You read English, she said. Some, enough. There was more to that story, more education hidden behind his careful words. But he was not ready to share it, and she was not ready to push. Dawn was breaking when they finished organizing Solomon's evidence. The documents told a story of greed and betrayal that reached far beyond anything Magnolia had imagined. Her husband had died protecting truth that could save thousands of acres and hundreds of families. We need help, she said. Ketna nodded. His hand covered hers where it rested on the papers. The touch was warm, steady, full of promise neither of them had words for yet. We need someone who understands white man's law. Outside the lodge, the camp was stirring to life. Women tending fires, children playing games that prepared them for adult responsibilities, families living ordinary lives that were about to be torn apart by forces they had never chosen to fight. Magnolia felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders. She could hide, stay safe in the valley, let others fight battles that were not technically hers. Or she could honor Solomon's sacrifice by finishing what he had started. The papers rustled in the morning wind. That found its way through the lodge entrance. Truth waiting to be told, justice waiting to be served, hope waiting to be born from the ashes of everything that had been lost. The blue uniforms appeared on the ridge like storm clouds gathering against the pale morning sky. Captain Vernon Hayes rode at their head with the rigid posture of a man who believed authority was his birthright. His questions about a missing woman had followed them even here. Magnolia watched from the lodge entrance as the patrol made its slow descent into the valley. 20 soldiers with rifles and suspicious eyes. They moved with the casual arrogance of men who had never questioned their right to go anywhere they pleased. Chief Nadua emerged from her lodge with the dignity of someone who had faced such visits before. Her silver hair caught the morning light. Her spine remained straight despite the weight of years and sorrows. She walked toward the approaching soldiers with measured steps that gave away nothing of the tension running through the camp. Ketna appeared at Magnolia's side. His hand touched her elbow in warning. The gesture spoke of careful planning, hidden preparations, the wisdom of people who had learned to survive by thinking 3 moves ahead. Stay inside, he said. They are looking for a ghost. The words carried layers of meaning she was only beginning to understand. Magnolia Beaumont was supposed to be dead, or disappeared, or transformed into something that no longer mattered to the white world. Her survival complicated narratives that powerful people preferred to keep simple. She retreated into the lodge, but positioned herself where she could hear the conversation between Nadua and Captain Hayes. His voice carried the educated accent of eastern cities. His questions held the precision of someone accustomed to getting answers. "We're looking for a colored woman. Taken from Redemption Creek 2 weeks ago. Intelligence suggests she might be in this area." Nadua's response came in carefully broken. English, the performance of someone pretending to understand less than she did. Magnolia recognized the strategy. Solomon had used similar tactics when dealing with officials who underestimated his intelligence. "Many people come. Many people go. We see all kinds." The evasion was masterful. Truthful without being helpful. Hayes pressed harder, but Nadua gave him nothing substantial. Eventually, the patrol moved on with warnings about harboring fugitives and threats about future visits. When the dust from their horses had settled, Birdie Crowfeather materialized from wherever she had been hiding. Her face held the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. "They know you're alive," she said to Magnolia. "Which means Whitmore knows his plan failed." The words settled into the silence between them, heavy with implication. Safety had always been an illusion. Now even that illusion was gone. That afternoon, Magnolia sat beside the creek with Solomon's papers spread across a flat stone. The documents told their story of corruption in neat columns of numbers and carefully forged signatures. Evidence that could topple governments or disappear completely depending on who controlled the telling. She had been avoiding the most damaging papers, the ones that implicated federal officials in Washington. Reading them would make her dangerous in ways that went far beyond local politics. But ignorance was no longer protection. The railroad contracts made her hands shake. Payments to senators for favorable votes. Bribes to surveyors for altered maps. A systematic theft of land that belonged to the Comanche by treaty and to freed families by federal promise. Millions of acres sold to private interests for fractions of their value. Ketna found her there as the sun touched the horizon. He sat beside her without speaking. His presence had become necessary to her in ways she was still learning to understand. Not the desperate need she had felt for Solomon's protection. Something deeper, more equal, built on respect rather than dependence. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. He studied the papers with growing comprehension. His questions revealed knowledge that surprised her. Understanding of legal concepts and political processes that had nothing to do with traditional Comanche education. "Where did you learn about land law?" she asked. The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Katana's eyes moved to the distant mountains. His hands stilled on the documents. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets. "Long held, Carlisle Industrial School, Pennsylvania, 5 years." The words hit her with unexpected force. Carlisle was where they sent native children to strip away their culture, to make them into something more acceptable to white society. The school that promised education but delivered cultural destruction. "They took you from your family." He nodded. The simple gesture contained years of loss and adaptation and survival. Her understanding of him shifted. The careful English, the knowledge of white customs, the ability to move between worlds without belonging completely to either. "I came back. But I brought. They're learning with me." That evening, Chief Nadua called them to her lodge. The fire cast dancing shadows on her weathered face. Her eyes held secrets that were finally ready to be shared. "I know what you're thinking," she said to Magnolia. "Use those papers to fight. In white man's courts. Make them follow their own laws." The words carried approval mixed with sadness. Hope tempered by experience. It might work, if you had the right help. The right connections. Nadua reached into a leather pouch and withdrew letters tied with ribbon. official correspondence on government paper. The writing was educated, feminine, determined. I've been writing to Washington for 2 years, building relationships, preparing for this fight. Magnolia stared at the letters. The careful handwriting belonged to someone comfortable with formal language and political procedures. Someone who understood how power moved through government channels. "You're not just a chief," she said. Nadua's smile held depths of story. That would take years to fully understand. Her next words fell into the silence between them with the weight of revelation. "My name was Margaret Parker, before the Comanche took me. Before I chose to stay. Before I learned that family is what you build, not what you're born into." The truth rearranged everything Magnolia thought she understood. Nadua was a bridge between worlds. A white woman who had become Comanche by choice. Someone who could navigate both cultures with equal skill. "I've been waiting for the right moment. The right evidence, the right person to carry it forward." She looked directly at Magnolia. The gaze held recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement of one survivor recognizing another. "I orchestrated your rescue, guided Birdie's intervention, even influenced Katana's decision to seek you out. Everything has been preparation for this moment." The words reordered the past 2 months into a different pattern. Her humiliation in Redemption Creek, the journey with Ketna, her growing understanding of the documents Solomon had died protecting. All of it had been carefully arranged by someone who saw possibilities where others saw only problems. "You've been planning this since Solomon died." "Since before Solomon died, I knew what he was investigating. I was feeding him information through Birdie. When they killed him, I knew you would be next." Magnolia felt the weight of manipulation and protection in equal measure. Her choices had been her own, but the circumstances that made those choices possible had been carefully created by someone who understood the game being played. "What happens now? Now we finish what your husband started. Use his evidence. Use my connections. Use Katana's legal training." The last words made Magnolia turn to look at Ketna. His face held resignation mixed with determination. Another secret revealed. Another layer of deception stripped away. Legal training? Carlisle wasn't just about cultural destruction, he said. Some of us learn to use their weapons against them. "I studied law, passed examinations. I'm qualified to practice in federal court." The revelation completed the picture Nadua had been painting. A former captive with government connections. A trained lawyer who looked like the enemy's stereotype of a savage. A widow with evidence that could topple corruption at the highest levels. "We have 48 hours, Nadua said. After that, the railroad starts construction. After that, legal challenges become meaningless. Outside the lodge, night sounds filled the valley. Owls calling to their mates. Wind moving through grass. That would soon be torn up for railroad ties. The ordinary music of a world about to change whether they were ready or not." Magnolia looked at the faces around the fire. People who had become family without her realizing it. People who were willing to risk everything for a chance at justice that might not come. "What do you need me to do?" Nadua's smile held fierce. Satisfaction. The expression of someone whose long planning was about to bear fruit. "Go back to Redemption Creek. Face the people who threw you away. Make them answer for what they've done." The morning they left for Redemption Creek carried the brittle clarity of first frost. Magnolia sat straight in the saddle, Solomon's documents secured in leather saddlebags that had belonged to Nadua's daughter. The weight of evidence pressed against her leg with each step of the horse. Ketna rode beside her dressed in clothes that belonged to no single world. Dark trousers and white shirt that spoke of Eastern education. Comanche vest and silver armbands that proclaimed his heritage. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to use others' expectations against them. Behind them, Tokala and 6 young warriors maintained careful distance, close enough to help if needed, far enough away to avoid immediate suspicion. Their horses moved through morning mist that clung to creek beds and low places. "If this fails," Magnolia said. "It won't fail." Katana's certainty carried the weight of someone who had spent years planning for this moment. But Magnolia had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he scanned the horizon. He was as frightened as she was. They made camp that night beside a spring that bubbled up from underground sources. Clear water that had never known pollution or ownership. Ketna built a small fire that gave light without announcing their presence to anyone watching from distant ridges. "Tell me about the law," she said. He fed twigs to the flames with methodical attention. His voice carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a tool rather than a birthright. "White man's law is like a river. It flows where power directs it. But sometimes the riverbank is strong enough to change the course." She understood. Justice was not guaranteed. But justice was possible if they were clever enough and brave enough and lucky enough. "What they did to you at Carlisle." The words hung between them in the firelight. He had never spoken directly about those years, the forced education, the cultural stripping, the attempt to kill the Comanche in him and rebuild something more acceptable. They took children who belonged to the wind, tried to make us belong to buildings and schedules and shame. His hands stilled on the kindling. "Some of us learned to take what was useful and leave the poison behind." She reached across the small space between them, took his hand in hers. The touch was warm and steady and full of understanding that needed no words. "I was afraid they had succeeded," he said, "until I saw you standing in that street, refusing to break under their cruelty. Then I remembered who I was supposed to be." The confession settled into the silence between them. Not love declared in flowery language. Something deeper, recognition, partnership, the understanding that they were stronger together than apart. She leaned toward him across the fire. He met her halfway. The kiss was gentle and certain and full of promises neither of them spoke aloud. When they separated, the night around them had changed. The future had changed. They were no longer two separate people fighting separate battles. They were family choosing to face whatever came together. The second day brought them within sight of Redemption Creek's church steeple. The town looked smaller than Magnolia. Remembered, meaner, a collection of buildings huddled against the vast sky without dignity or beauty. They could see railroad surveying equipment at the town's eastern edge. Stakes driven into ground that had belonged to other people until very recently. The theft was already beginning. Captain Hayes and his patrol were camped beside the creek. 20 soldiers who represented federal authority. Their presence complicated everything. Magnolia could not simply disappear again if the legal challenge failed. "He's waiting for us," she said. Ketna nodded. His hand moved to check the leather folder containing his credentials, educational certificates and legal qualifications that would surprise everyone who saw him as just another savage. "Good. Let him wait." They rode into town as the afternoon sun cast long shadows between buildings. People emerged from stores and houses to stare at the impossible sight. The woman they had thrown away returning with dignity intact and purpose burning in her eyes. Mayor Whitmore appeared on the courthouse steps. His face cycled through surprise, fear, and calculation in the space of 3 heartbeats. Behind him stood the railroad executives who had been expecting clear ground for their construction. "You were supposed to be dead," he said. The words carried all the venom and disappointment of a plan gone wrong. Magnolia dismounted with careful grace. Ketna followed suit. Together they approached the courthouse steps with Solomon's evidence secured between them. "Disappointed?" she asked. Whitmore's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The crowd gathered behind them was growing. Word of her return spread through the town with the speed of scandal. Captain Hayes emerged from the sheriff's office with the measured pace of someone who believed he was finally getting answers to troubling questions. His uniform was pressed. His weapons were polished. His confidence was absolute. "Mrs. Beaumont, you've caused considerable concern with your disappearance." The false solicitude in his voice made her skin crawl. Everyone knew she had not disappeared voluntarily. Everyone knew no one had been concerned about her welfare. "I've been gathering evidence," she said. She produced the first document from her saddlebag. A survey map showing the true boundaries of Comanche territory, land that belonged to them by federal treaty. Land the railroad was preparing to steal. Evidence of what? Hayes asked. Fraud, bribery, theft of federal land. She handed him the map. "Would you like to see more?" The crowd pressed closer. Mrs. Henderson from the general store. Tom Miller, who fixed wagon wheels. The Pattersons, who attended church every Sunday. People who had laughed at her humiliation, now watching with growing unease. Ketna stepped forward. His movement drew every eye. The savage who was supposed to be simple, primitive, easily dismissed. "I am Ayana Tashawika," he said. His English carried no trace of the broken speech they expected. Graduate of Carlisle Industrial School. Licensed to practice law in federal court. "I represent Mrs. Beaumont and the Comanche Nation in this matter." The words fell into the gathered crowd with the force of thunder. Everything they thought they knew rearranged itself around this new information. Whitmore's face went pale. The railroad executives whispered urgent conferences among themselves. Captain Hayes studied Ketna with the attention of someone reassessing a situation that had just become much more complicated. "You can't be serious," Whitmore said. "Dead serious." Magnolia produced another document, then another. Evidence of forged signatures, bribed officials, illegal land transfers. "My husband died protecting this information. Now it's going to protect the people you tried to steal from." The sun was setting behind the courthouse. Long shadows stretched across the dusty street where she had been humiliated and traded away. But she was no longer the same woman who had been broken by their cruelty. She was Pia Tekwapu, woman who sees truth, wife to a man who saw her worth, keeper of evidence that could change everything. "We demand a federal hearing," Ketna said. "We demand justice under the law you claim to represent." Hayes looked from the documents to the crowd, to the railroad executives who were paying for his cooperation. His certainty was cracking. The simple narrative of civilization versus savagery no longer fit the evidence before him. "This is highly irregular," he said. "So is murder," Magnolia replied. "So is theft. So is giving away human beings for entertainment." The words hit the crowd with uncomfortable force. Their laughter from 2 months ago suddenly seemed less innocent. Their participation in her humiliation carried weight they had not considered. Ketna opened his legal portfolio. Official papers that established his right to practice in federal court. Credentials that made him the equal of any lawyer in Washington. 48 hours, he said to Hayes, before railroad construction begins. Before this evidence becomes meaningless. You can be part of justice or part of the cover-up. The choice hung in the air between them. Captain Hayes looked at the gathered crowd. At Whitmore's desperate face. At the railroad executives, who were already calculating the cost of exposure. "Very well," he said finally. "Federal hearing. Day after tomorrow. But if this is some kind of trick—" "No tricks," Magnolia said. "Just truth. The kind my husband died for. The kind worth fighting for." She looked around at the faces that had once mocked her. Saw uncertainty where there had been cruel confidence. Saw fear where there had been casual dismissal. The woman they had thrown away had returned with power they could not ignore. Tomorrow would bring judgment. Tonight brought the satisfaction of watching them realize their mistake. The federal courthouse in Redemption Creek had never hosted anything more significant than cattle theft trials. Now it overflowed with spectators who sensed history being made. Railroad executives occupied the front rows with the rigid posture of men accustomed to getting their way. Townspeople filled every remaining seat with the nervous energy of people who might be witnessing their own judgment. Judge Samuel Morrison had arrived on the morning train with federal authority tucked into his black robes. His weathered face held the careful neutrality of someone who had seen enough corruption to recognize it at a glance. He surveyed the packed courtroom with eyes that missed nothing. Magnolia sat at the plaintiff's table beside Ketna, who wore the dark suit of an Eastern lawyer. His transformation was complete. The savage Redemption Creek had dismissed was gone. In his place sat a man who belonged in any courtroom in America. Behind them, Chief Nadua occupied a seat of honor. Her silver hair was braided with ribbons that caught the morning light. She had chosen to attend as Margaret Parker today. Her presence reminded everyone that identity was more complex than appearance suggested. Mayor Whitmore whispered urgent consultations with his attorney, a railroad lawyer from Chicago who charged by the hour and promised results that were looking increasingly unlikely. Sweat beaded on Whitmore's forehead despite the morning chill. Judge Morrison called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound cut through the murmur of conversation and speculation. Silence settled over the room, heavy with anticipation. This is a federal hearing regarding allegations of fraudulent land transfers affecting both treaty obligations and homestead rights, Morrison announced. I will tolerate no disruptions. Ketna rose from his chair with fluid grace. His voice carried the authority of someone trained to command attention through logic rather than volume. Your Honor, we will demonstrate systematic fraud perpetrated by local officials in collaboration with railroad interests. Fraud that violates federal treaties, homestead laws, and basic principles of justice. He produced Solomon's first document, a survey map that showed the true boundaries of Comanche territory as established by federal treaty. The land stretched far beyond what the railroad claimed was available for purchase. This map was prepared by Solomon Beaumont in the months before his death. It shows treaty lands illegally designated for railroad use. The railroad attorney objected with practiced indignation. His client had purchased the land through proper channels. All transactions were legal and binding. Ketna smiled with the patience of someone who had expected exactly this response. Legal according to forged documents. Binding according to signatures that don't exist. He produced the next piece of evidence. This is a treaty transfer supposedly signed by Chief Nadua in 1871. Chief Nadua is present in this courtroom. She will testify that she never signed any such document. Nadua rose from her seat with the dignity of someone who had bridged 2 worlds through choice rather than circumstance. Her voice carried the clarity of truth that needed no embellishment. I never signed, never agreed, never sold 1 acre of treaty land to any railroad. The words fell into the courtroom silence with the weight of absolute certainty. The railroad attorney shuffled through papers with growing desperation. His carefully constructed case was crumbling with each revelation. Magnolia took the witness stand as the morning sun streamed through tall windows. The light illuminated her face and cast her shadow across the floor, where Whitmore sat sweating through his collar. Tell the court about your husband's death, Ketna said. She spoke quietly about Solomon's final weeks. His growing fear as he uncovered the scope of corruption. His careful documentation of fraud that reached from Redemption Creek to Washington. His urgent whispers about evidence that could save thousands of acres from a legal seizure. He was murdered for what he discovered, she said. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Whitmore's face went white. The railroad executives huddled in whispered conferences that grew more urgent by the moment. Objection, the railroad attorney called. No proof of murder. Judge Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands folded carefully on the bench before him. "Mrs. Beaumont, do you have evidence to support this claim?" She produced Solomon's medical records, documentation of his sudden illness, the strange symptoms that suggested poisoning rather than natural disease, the convenient timing of his death, just as he was preparing to expose the land fraud. Solomon was a healthy man until he started asking questions about railroad surveys. Then he fell ill with symptoms no doctor could explain. He died the night before he planned to contact federal authorities. The evidence painted a picture that was damning in its implications. Whitmore's hands shook as he tried to maintain his composure. The railroad executives were already calculating the cost of scandal and federal investigation. Kitna presented the financial documents with the methodical precision of someone trained in legal procedure. Bank transfers that showed payments to local officials, bribes disguised as consulting fees, a paper trail that connected railroad money to forged signatures and illegal land transfers. "This corruption extends beyond Redemption Creek," he told the court. "It threatens New Hope Settlement, where freed families have built their lives. It violates treaty obligations to the Comanche Nation. It represents theft on a scale that demands federal intervention." The morning stretched into afternoon as evidence accumulated in devastating detail. Each document reinforced the pattern of systematic fraud. Each witness testimony added weight to accusations that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Judge Morrison called a brief recess to review the evidence in chambers. The courtroom buzzed with speculation and nervous energy. Whitmore sat hunched in his chair as if trying to make himself invisible. The railroad executives spoke in urgent whispers with their attorney who had run out of objections. When court reconvened, Morrison's face held the grim satisfaction of someone who had found clarity in a complex situation. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that fraudulent land transfers have occurred in violation of federal treaty obligations and homestead laws. All railroad construction on disputed territories will cease immediately pending federal investigation." The words hit the courtroom with the force of Judgment Day. The railroad executives stood to leave with the hasty movements of men who needed to be anywhere else. Whitmore buried his face in his hands as the reality of federal charges settled around him. But Judge Morrison was not finished. "Furthermore, this court recommends that Mayor Whitmore and his co-conspirators face federal charges for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Captain Hayes, you will ensure their cooperation with federal investigators." Hayes nodded with the resignation of someone who had backed the wrong side and knew it. His certainty about civilization and savagery had been replaced by uncomfortable questions about justice and corruption. The gavel fell with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. Justice had been served in a place that had rarely seen its arrival. Magnolia stood beside Ketna as the crowd slowly dispersed. The people who had once mocked her now avoided her eyes. Their cruelty had been transformed into something that would haunt them for years to come. "It's over," she said. Ketna took her hand in his. The touch was warm and steady and full of promises about the future they would build together. "It's beginning," he replied. 6 months later, Magnolia stood in the doorway of a schoolhouse that served both New Hope Settlement and Katana's band. Children of different backgrounds sat together learning to read and write and understand that knowledge belonged to everyone who sought it. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly where new life grew. The child would be born into a world where justice was possible, where love could cross any boundary, where truth was stronger than the lies people told to justify their cruelty. The railroad ran along a new route that benefited both communities. Bertie Crow Feather had been elected mayor of Redemption Creek on a platform of honest government and equal treatment. The changes rippled outward in ways that would be felt for generations. Magnolia wore a dress that combined African American traditions with Comanche artistry. The fabric spoke of worlds connected rather than divided, of strength found in difference, rather than conformity. She was no longer the woman who had been broken by cruel laughter in a dusty street. She was Pia Tekwapu, woman who sees truth, bridge between worlds that needed connection more than separation. The future stretched before them wide as the Texas sky, full of possibility, full of hope, full of the quiet satisfaction that came from turning pain into purpose and humiliation into triumph. The woman they had thrown away had become exactly who she was meant to be, and that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.